My name is Marlene Ashford. I am 67 years old. For most of my life, I believed quiet mornings were a blessing. The house on Lakeview Road sits at the edge of Burlington, where the air smells faintly of pine and the lake catches light like glass. Since Henry's passing 6 years ago, silence has been both my comfort and my punishment. That morning began like so many others: coffee, dishes, the low hum of the radio. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, had come by early with a box of blueberry muffins from the bakery downtown. She's always so polished, even for a weekday hair curled, nails the color of rosewood. "Just dropping these off before I run to the store," she said, setting her phone beside the sugar bowl. I told her to drive carefully. She smiled, promised she would, and was gone before my coffee cooled. I remember noticing how her phone screen reflected the sunlight on the table. Then I turned back to rinsing the cups. A few minutes later, a buzz cut through the stillness. It was the small, vibrating kind of sound that barely exists until it's the only thing you can hear. I wiped my hands on a towel and glanced over. The screen had lit up. Henry's face looked back at me. The same photo I'd kept framed on the mantel, the one taken on our last trip to Maine. He was smiling, wind in his hair, alive. My chest clenched. For a moment, I thought my mind had betrayed me, another trick of memory. But then I saw the message glowing beneath his name. Thursday, same time. Can't wait to see you again. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered across the floor. Coffee spread in a dark bloom over the tile. My breath came shallow, uneven. The room seemed to shrink around that single sentence pulsing on the screen. I reached for the phone, my hands shaking. Every rational thought, every line between right and wrong blurred under the weight of that name. Henry Ashford, dead for 6 years. Still smiling at me from the glow of Rachel's phone. The screen dimmed, then went dark, leaving only my reflection in the glass. I stood there, gripping the counter, trying to steady the tremor in my chest. Outside, the wind stirred through the maples. Inside, the quiet was gone. I told myself not to touch it. It wasn't mine, and I had no right to pry. But the glow of that screen burned like a warning I couldn't ignore. I picked up Rachel's phone with both hands, my fingers trembling as if it were something alive and dangerous. The message was still there: Thursday, same time. Can't wait to see you again. The contact name above it was only one letter H. That simple initial seemed to echo in my head. Henry. My heart thudded so hard it hurt. I tapped the name. A thread of messages opened, line after line stretching back through time, weeks, months, years. The earliest ones dated from before Henry's death. The most recent were from 3 days ago. You looked beautiful yesterday. I miss your touch. Same place next week. Don't tell anyone. Every sentence hit like a small, deliberate cut. The words were warm, intimate, unmistakably familiar. I scrolled faster, my breath catching. Each message was worse than the one before. There were photos, 2 dozens of them. One showed Rachel in her kitchen, laughing into the camera. Another, Henry sitting across from her in a diner I didn't recognize, wearing the gray wool coat I'd given him for Christmas the year before he died. His smile wasn't the one I remembered, the one he used for family pictures. It was softer, private. My vision blurred. I blinked hard and kept scrolling. Another photo appeared, the 2 of them together at a lakeside cabin, his arm around her waist. Her hair was shorter then, his face more lined. The timestamp made my stomach twist. 7 months after his funeral. I dropped the phone onto the counter as if it had burned me. The sound of it hitting the wood jolted me back to myself. I stepped away, one hand pressed to my chest, gasping for air that wouldn't come. There had to be an explanation, some trick, some cruel imitation. Maybe someone was blackmailing her using Henry's old photos, his memory. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be him. But his voice echoed in my head, the deep timbre I could still hear when I dreamed. Henry, laughing, calling my name from across the yard on summer evenings. My husband of 42 years, the man who built this house board by board and read me poetry when the power went out. I remembered the night he died, the call from the hospital, the sterile smell of the corridor, the way they wouldn't let me see him until everything was done, the weight of his wedding ring in my palm afterward. And yet, here he was, texting my daughter-in-law as if death had never come. I forced myself to pick up the phone again, scrolling to the newest message. Thursday, same time. The pattern repeated every week. Always Thursday. Always the same phrase. Something in me shifted. Shock gave way to something colder resolve. If Rachel was in danger, I needed to know. If she wasn't, then I needed to know that, too. I wiped my hands, locked the phone, and set it back exactly as she'd left it. Then I stared at the broken mug still lying on the floor. My reflection wavered in the spilled coffee, a face I barely recognized. Outside, the wind rattled the glass panes, and for the first time since Henry's death, the house no longer felt empty. It felt haunted. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Henry's face glowing from Rachel's phone. The messages looped through my mind until dawn bled into the curtains. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The key to Henry's study still hung on the hook behind the pantry door. I hadn't touched it in 6 years. When I slid it into the lock, the metal resisted for a moment, as if the house itself disapproved. The smell hit first old paper, dust, and cedar polish. The air inside was still and stale, as if time had stopped the day they carried him out. Henry's desk sat where it always had, facing the window that overlooked the maples. A thin coat of dust covered everything: his reading glasses, a fountain pen, a cracked photo of us taken in 1978. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk, half expecting to feel his warmth lingering in the grain. Drawers groaned when I pulled them open. Receipts, old letters from the hardware store, insurance papers. Every document was dated neatly, stacked in Henry's exacting order. He'd always been a man who believed order could prevent chaos. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of invoices, I found something that didn't belong: a manila envelope sealed and labeled in his handwriting. Arareco property. My breath caught. I tore it open and unfolded a single page. It was a deed, notarized and stamped, transferring ownership of a cabin on the northern edge of Lake Champlain. I remembered that cabin. Years ago, Henry told me he'd sold it, said it was too much to maintain. I'd believed him without question. The deed said otherwise. It was still in his name. The date of the document was 2 years before his death. I sank into his chair, the leather creaking under my weight. My hands shook as I traced his signature at the bottom of the page. Why lie about a place he'd never taken me to through the dusty window? The morning light touched the maple leaves, and for the first time, I wondered how much of our life had been built on half-truths. The study around me seemed smaller now, closing in with the weight of unspoken things. I folded the deed, slipped it into my coat pocket, and locked the door behind me. If the answers waited at that cabin, I would find them by noon. I was already on the road. The map in my glove compartment still showed the faint outline of Arareco Point, a small curve of land near the northern edge of Lake Champlain. Henry and I used to drive past it on our way to the farmer's market. He'd always say, "Someday we should rent a place up there." I never knew he already owned one. The closer I drove, the more the sky darkened. The air felt heavier near the water, filled with the scent of pine and cold stone. When the cabin finally came into view through the trees, I braked too hard, tires crunching over gravel. It looked like something out of a photograph, small, tidy, with a porch facing the lake. A place meant for hiding, not living. I parked near the steps. The lock on the front door was clean, recently oiled. My fingers trembled as I tried the knob. It turned easily, Inside, the air was still, but not dead. The faint scent of detergent and candle wax lingered, and the floorboards creaked softly under my shoes. On the kitchen counter sat 2 wine glasses, one with a faint trace of lipstick. A half-empty bottle of Merlot stood beside them, cork still resting on the counter as if waiting to be used again. Every surface felt recently touched the folded blanket on the sofa, the pillow still indented. I ran my hand along the armchair and froze. Draped across it was a navy windbreaker with the initials H.A. embroidered near the cuff. Henry's jacket. I'd packed it away after his funeral, along with the rest of his clothes. My knees went weak. I caught the edge of the table to steady myself and forced a slow breath. The cabin wasn't abandoned. Someone had been living here, someone who knew him well enough to keep his things. In the small bedroom, light filtered through thin curtains. On the nightstand sat a silver frame, slightly tilted. I picked it up. Rachel, her head thrown back in laughter, her arms wrapped around a man. My pulse roared in my ears. The man's hair was grayer, the lines deeper around his eyes. But the face, God help me, it was Henry's. My grip loosened. The photo fell to the floor, the glass cracking across their smiling faces. I sank onto the bed, the air thick with dust and disbelief. For 6 years, I'd mourned a man buried under Vermont soil. But in this cabin by the lake, he was alive again in the arms of my son's wife. I drove back the next morning. The sky a thin sheet of gray over the lake. I told myself I wouldn't go inside again. Just one more look, just to be sure. But certainty is a strange thing. It never feels like enough. At the hardware store in town, I bought a small motion camera, the kind meant for watching deer trails. The young clerk showed me how to link it to my phone. I nodded, pretending calm while my hands shook so hard I could barely sign the receipt. By the time I returned to the cabin, the air smelled of wet pine. I slipped inside quietly and placed the camera high on the bookshelf facing the living room, its lens small and unblinking. It would capture everything: the doorway, the couch, the table where the wine glasses had waited. I left as fast as I could, the entire drive home. My heart drummed against the steering wheel. I told myself I'd made a mistake, that I'd gone too far, but that night, when the feed connected, I couldn't look away. Thursday came. I watched from my kitchen, laptop open on the counter, the camera's faint static humming through the speakers. At 4:30, movement flickered on the screen. Rachel stepped inside, wearing the same blue sweater she'd worn the day she brought me muffins. She brushed her hair in the reflection of the window, then set a candle on the table and lit it. 10 minutes later, the door opened again. A man entered. Same height, same shoulders, same walk. The camera's light caught his face, and the air left my body. Henry, or someone made in his image. Rachel crossed the room, smiling softly, and he leaned down to kiss her. My hand flew to the laptop. The screen went black before the sound of my own breath could betray me. By dawn, I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. The image of Rachel and that man Henry, or whoever he was, haunted every breath. I drove back to the lake, the road narrowing between walls of fog. When the cabin appeared through the mist, my pulse quickened. Rachel opened the door after my second knock. Her face went pale, her voice barely steady. "Marlene, you shouldn't be here. Where is he?" I asked. Before she could answer, a voice came from inside. "It's all right, Rachel." He stepped forward, and the world tilted, older, gray at the temples, but the same face, my husband's face. I gripped the doorframe. "Who are you?" "My name is Richard Ashford," he said quietly. "Henry's twin brother. We were separated at birth. I found him through a medical search years ago." Rachel's eyes dropped to the floor. "It's true. Henry wanted to protect you. He didn't want you tangled in the past." My throat burned. He lied to me, to everyone. Richard's voice softened. Henry was tired of his life. He talked about leaving, starting over. He planned to disappear, but his heart gave out before he could. Rachel added, trembling, after he died, I couldn't let go. Richard looked so much like him. It felt like getting him back. I raised a hand. Don't. The word hung between us. Outside, waves broke softly against the rocks. I looked at them both. The stranger wearing my husband's face, and the woman who had once called me family. Every truth they spoke only deepened the betrayal. And in that moment, I realized the dead weren't the only ones who could haunt the living. The drive home blurred into silence. The trees along the road seemed to lean inward, whispering things I didn't want to hear. By the time I reached Burlington, the air had turned sharp. The kind that seeps through your coat and straight into your bones. I left the car in the driveway and stood there for a long moment before I could make myself go inside. The house greeted me with the same stillness it always had. Yet tonight, it felt different, hollow, like it knew something had shifted. I moved through the hallway without turning on the lights and stopped in the living room. Henry's chair sat in its usual place by the window, the fabric worn smooth where his hands used to rest. I lowered myself into it slowly. The smell of leather rose up, faint but familiar. For years, I had refused to sit here. It had felt sacred somehow, a place that belonged to a man I thought I'd loved and buried. Now it was just a chair empty, like the truth he left behind. My hand went to my ring. I twisted it once, twice, feeling the cold metal cut into my skin. I remembered our wedding day, the way his voice trembled when he promised forever. What did forever even mean? If love could turn into this. On the end table sat the old landline phone. I stared at it until my vision blurred. I could call David. I could tell him everything about the cabin, about Rachel, about the man with his father's face. He deserved the truth. But when I picked up the receiver, my throat closed. David's laughter echoed in my memory, the way he still talked about his father with pride. I couldn't take that from him. Not yet. I set the phone down gently and leaned back in the chair. The house creaked as the wind passed through the eaves. Not yet, I whispered into the dark. Not tonight. They arrived just after 6, the smell of rain still clinging to their coats. David carried a bottle of red wine, proud as always to bring something nice for dinner. Rachel followed, her smile polished, her eyes unreadable. We ate roast chicken and potatoes, the kind of meal that fills the silence when no one knows what to say. David talked about work, about the new expansion at the mill. I nodded when needed, keeping my gaze steady on Rachel. She looked perfectly calm, as if nothing in the world had ever touched her. When David stood to check the leaky pipe on the porch, I poured more wine into her glass. She watched the stream fall, careful not to meet my eyes. Rachel, I said quietly, if you hurt him again, I'll tell him everything about you, about the cabin, about what I saw. Her fingers froze on the stem of the glass. For a moment, her mask slipped. The color drained from her face. Then she forced another smile, small and tight. You won't have to, she whispered. I leaned back in my chair, the rain tapping softly against the window. See that I don't. David's footsteps returned down the hall. I picked up my fork and smiled as if nothing had happened. 3 weeks passed before I went to the cemetery again. The ground was still soft from spring rain, and the sky hung low over the lake. I carried fresh lilies, the kind Henry used to bring me when we were first married. But when I reached his headstone, the vase was already full. Red roses, dozens of them, arranged with careful hands. Their stems were wrapped in a white ribbon, tied in a perfect bow. No note, no name. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The color was too vivid, too alive for a grave. I didn't cry. I simply lifted the vase, cradling it against my coat, and walked back to the car. At home, I placed the roses in the fireplace, one by one. I pulled the petals apart, dropping them into the flames. They curled and blackened, releasing a smell that was both sweet and bitter. Smoke rose in thin ribbons, filling the room until my eyes watered. When the last petal turned to ash, I closed the grate and sat beside the fading glow. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt like waiting. Summer came quietly that year. The trees along the street were heavy with green, and for the first time in months, I heard laughter in the house again. David had started smiling small, hesitant smiles that grew stronger each week. He talked about work, about a new project at the mill, and sometimes even about taking a trip with friends. Rachel moved out of Burlington before the end of June. There was no scandal, no shouting match. Only a short letter left on David's kitchen table. She wrote that she needed distance, time to think, space to start over. He folded the letter once and never mentioned it again. The days passed gently. I learned to enjoy the quiet again, the good kind, not the haunted one. I tended the garden, baked on Sundays, and sometimes caught my reflection in the window without flinching. One evening, as the sun faded over the lake, I noticed the old porch light had burned out. Henry had wired it himself, decades ago. When we first moved into the house, I climbed the step stool, replaced the bulb, and turned the switch. Warm light spilled across the porch. I stood there for a moment and whispered, "This light isn't for waiting anymore. It's for peace."